Hello and welcome to the Freedom from Religion Foundation's Ask an Atheist. I'm Chris Line, legal counsel here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. This week, we're highlighting the good work of a Baptist minister who understands why it's so important for religion and government to be separate. Joining me from Oklahoma is our Regional Governmental Affairs Manager, Mickey Dollens. Hey, Mickey.
Hey, Chris. How you doing? Great to be here.
Hey. As always, we want to hear your thoughts on the topics we discussed today. Please leave your questions in the chat below or email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. We'll try our best to answer your questions live during the show. Now, joining me and Mickey today is Brian Kaylor, a Baptist minister from Missouri, who's an accomplished writer and editor-in-chief of the Christian media company Word and Way. He's also the host of the podcast Dangerous Dogma, which challenges dangerous teachings found in various strands of Christianity. Brian has a PhD in political communication and has been an advocate for the constitutional principle of separation of church and state, as well as taking a stand against Christian nationalism. Welcome to Ask an Atheist, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Hey, Brian, last month we were looking at some bills in Missouri. There's a common theme going around right now with the chaplain bills, and you gave it a great line. You said, this is nothing but a chaplain in name only bill, a CINO. And so you gave some great testimony in that, and we'd love to take a closer look at that, if you could roll the tape.
My name is Brian Kaylor, and I lead Word and Way, which is a Christian nonprofit that's been here in Missouri since 1896. And as a Baptist minister and the father of a public school child, I'm concerned about this legislation, and I want to highlight two really significant problems with it. The first is it's a chaplain in name only, because there aren't actually requirements in the legislation itself about who can be a chaplain. There's actually nothing in this legislation that would prevent a school district from hiring that street preacher to come in and be the school chaplain. There's nothing in there at all. A chaplain in a lot of these other roles are an administrator, because their job is not merely to proselytize and to push their own faith. Their job is to facilitate so that all people, regardless of their faith tradition, can worship and experience faith as they so desire. Let's make sure we actually have some strong requirements about who a chaplain is, other than they can pass a background check and they're not a sexual predator. I mean, those are great, baselines for anybody walking into our public schools, but that does not make someone a chaplain. The second problem is there's also nothing in this legislation that would prevent proselytation. We're talking about minors. And so we have to be much more careful to make sure that we're not violating the parental rights, and that we're not violating the rights of parents and their faith communities to be the ones that provide the spiritual care. But I'm also concerned about the concern of proselytization because of the leading organization behind this bill, the National School Chaplains Association. On their website, they proclaim that we are God's representatives on school campuses. And Rocky Malloy, the leader of the organization, has said that good news, prayer is back in schools. School chaplaincy is the first opportunity in 60 years to recover religious liberty lost when prayer was kicked out of school in 1962. To make prayer a school in reality, please give your best gift to the National School Chaplain Association. Right? So you already see that there's a goal here. It's not a generic chaplaincy program. It's a proselytization school. Let's get unconstitutional school prayer, government prayer back into schools. But we can see from the goals, the stated public goals of the organization that wrote this legislation for Texas and then Florida and Louisiana now here, their goal is to push God and prayer in public schools. That concerns me a lot, especially when there are no guardrails in this legislation. So as a Baptist minister, as a product of the public school system, and as a father of a public school child, I urge you to vote against this bill. I'm happy to take any questions.
I'm just perplexed by your as a Baptist minister. You're against, I guess being an ambassador of God. Is that not what every Christian's job is to be?
Yeah, but we think that that's not done through state coercion, because we were persecuted by the state and the collusion of church and state, and so. The issue of coercion here is if someone doesn't have the right to say no, then they don't have the right to say yes. And that's why Baptists have believed in the separation of church and state. And it is a constitutional principle. It's true, you won't find the words in there. You also won't find the phrase religious liberty in the Constitution. But guess what? It's a constitutional principle based on the First Amendment and Article 6, just like separation of church and state is a constitutional principle based on the First Amendment and Article 6.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. There's a lot to unpack there, but I think people listening at home would be curious to know what leads a Baptist minister to be such a strong advocate for the separation of church and state. Was there a personal experience, a theological experience that led you to speaking out on these government overreach bills?
Yeah, I mean, it really was in college. I went to a Baptist college, and learning Baptist history and learning the theological and the governmental reasons why Baptists historically have fought for church-state separation. The first English book calling for true religious liberty for all people was written in 1612 by one of the two founding Baptist pastors of the Baptist movement. He later died in prison because King James, yes, that King James, put him in prison for suggesting that everyone should have religious freedom. He was so radical, it wasn't just that he was saying his people should have religious freedom. He was saying that that should also include Muslims and atheists. And no one was making that argument at that time. And then that, we see that in the founding of the United States. Roger Williams founded not only Rhode Island, the first colony that separated church and state, he was also a co-founder of the first Baptist church in the Americas. And one of my favorite quotes about this topic is from Roger Williams. He said that forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. Baptist ministers like John Leland were influential in impacting James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. And so I've just embraced this as part of the theological history. It's become a lot more in action in the last few years as I've gotten involved in state advocacy and realizing there's a lot of pushback to that. But yeah, it was a very key part of my theological identity.
The committee chair seemed completely perplexed that you're a Baptist minister yet defending the separation of church and state. Do you find that's a common reaction from other faith leaders? Do you feel like excluded from your faith community by some people who just don't quite understand why you're standing up for constitutional principles?
Yeah, unfortunately today, most Baptists today no longer believe in church-state separation. And so I think that is why I get why people are surprised that I care about church-state separation, that I believe it's good for both the church and for the state. And unfortunately, we've seen a shift among the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant convention, about half of Baptists in the United States in the late 70s, early 80s, moved away from the historic position of believing in church-state separation to now embracing, trying to enact Christian nationalism. And so, but when the school prayer decision, for instance, came out in 1962, that the School Chaplain Association is trying to undo with their chaplains legislation, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention praised that decision. I mean, there were Christians at the time that criticized it, but the Southern Baptists praised it. Word and Way that I lead is today an ecumenical Christian organization, but at the time we were a Southern Baptist publication, and our editors at the time praised the Supreme Court decision. So this is the historic position, but I do understand why people are surprised that I take this position today.
This particular bill, going back to Senate Bill 49 and 118, which are two bills combined into one. Missouri is one of the states trying to pass a school chaplain bill. Oklahoma has two. So far, successfully, 3 states have passed school chaplain bills. That's Texas, Florida, Louisiana, and by your count, about a couple dozen more. What would you say to legislators who are trying to reconcile their personal faith with being a state lawmaker who represents people from many different varied backgrounds of religious faiths and the lack thereof?
Yeah, and unfortunately, we are seeing that like Christian nationalism is like a bad weed, right? It just keeps spreading and growing, and so the map has even increased this year. That I think there's at least 22 states. It's just spreading that are introducing this bill, and it really does show just a complete lack of care for the diversity in our schools. This program and other efforts like it to push more Christianity, a conservative version of Christianity in public schools, really would paint our children as second-class citizens based on what they believe in their own schools. And I have a real problem. I mean, my son's in middle school, and middle school is tough enough. I mean, none of us want to go back to middle school. And imagine then also throwing in the like, and now you're kind of counted as not really fully American enough and not really part of the school enough because of your religious beliefs. That's just wrong.
So what is the current status on the bill that you testified in opposition to?
Yeah, so unfortunately, despite my brilliant arguments, it did pass the Senate committee. And then it has also, I think it was a party line vote there, it has also passed the full Senate now. And it's important to note that it received a co-sponsor at the Senate level that is also a Democratic senator. So this is a bipartisan problem. It's mostly coming from the right that we're seeing this push for these chaplain bills and some of the other efforts to put Christian nationalism in our public schools. But we also have a problem with some Democratic lawmakers as well signing on to this legislation. So it has passed the full Senate, and it has been first and second read in the House. It's awaiting a committee assignment. So at the moment it has stalled a little bit, but we are literally right now at the halfway mark of the legislative session. So there's a lot of time for it to continue to move.
Well, it's optimistic that it hasn't received a committee hearing or assignment yet. So that's some good news. Hopefully leadership in the House will see how this is problematic. I'm dealing with the same issue in Oklahoma. We get a lot of information from this particular organization that is pushing this type of legislation. Could you go into a little bit more detail about the history of the chaplain bills, where they come from, and the architect behind it?
Yeah, so Texas, you've mentioned 3 states have passed it, but Texas was first. They passed it 2 years ago, and then Florida and Louisiana last year. And honestly, in Texas 2 years ago, it wasn't even the bill that was attracting a lot of the attention. So there was the Ten Commandments legislation, which I know we'll talk about in a moment because it's also in Missouri and Texas again and everywhere. But that one actually failed 2 years ago in Texas. But then this chaplain bill suddenly, went through. In Texas, there was this provision that all of the school boards had to actually vote by a particular time as to whether or not they would create the chaplain program. And there was some great advocacy work done by a number of organizations that I do know that all of the largest, the couple of dozen largest school districts in Texas all voted that down. That provision was also in the Missouri bill. They took it out because there were some senators that were complaining about that kind of forced mandate making the school boards actually vote on this issue. And then so the next year, we saw Florida, we saw Louisiana pick it up. And it is coming from the National Association of School Chaplains. And despite their name, right, that might sound like they're kind of a generic. This is a Christian right organization. As I quoted in a testimony that you played, they are pushing Christian nationalism. They've said the quiet part out loud. I mean, that's what I think is really important to note here is they have said their goals. And this is copy and paste legislation, right? The bills all look the same because they helped write it. And in Missouri, I mean, we also know this is where it's coming from. One of the 2 bill sponsors noted that he had met with Rocky Molloy, the leader of the organization, to talk about this legislation. Someone from Oklahoma that works for the organization had come into the state to testify before I had gotten up there to testify. And so they're very clear that their fingerprints are all over this bill. And like I said, they've said the quiet part out loud. We know what this legislation is all about.
Kind of an interesting development as it made its way onto the Senate floor. Your name was actually brought up again by one of the senators. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, when I saw that the legislation had passed, I went to listen to the audio just because I wanted to be prepared for if this goes to the House committee level. I wanted to kind of know what some of the arguments were that were being made. And I was listening to I think it was an hour and 45-minute conversation on the floor about this bill. And all of a sudden I realized that suddenly I was being criticized. Well, first, I guess I was being noted. A Democratic senator made a comment about how she's heard from a number of chaplains across the state that are opposed to actual chaplains that are opposed to this legislation, and that ministers were testifying against it. And then one of the co-sponsors of the legislation, Senator Moon, who is really one of the leading proponents of Christian nationalism in Missouri for the last few years, suddenly went off and said, he claims he's a Baptist minister, but I don't think he's part of a Baptist church, and he's not a preacher, so that's kind of interesting. And then they talked a little bit about the fact that I've testified against bills quite a bit over the past few years. And I had to admit, I was just kind of like, wait a minute, what? That's, I didn't expect it to pop up. And I find this ironic. I mean, I think he was trying to say that I'm not a pastor of a Baptist church right now. I have pastored a church in the past. My full-time ministry role is with Warden Way. But I am a member of a Baptist church that's 3 blocks from the state capitol. As I noted it, I play the cello in the church orchestra when I'm not preaching somewhere. And so I'm literally on the worship live stream. Most Sundays you can tell that I have evidence that I was at church. And I do preach at a number of different denominations from time to time around the state and elsewhere. And so, it's just one of those weird moments where they can't defute the arguments. I guess they want to try to attack the messenger. But this is what Christian nationalism does. Right? It doesn't just go after religious minorities and non-believers and atheists, which would be bad enough. I mean, in our pluralistic democracy, that's a real threat that Christian nationalists want to exclude anyone. But they also want to exclude anyone who's a Christian that doesn't meet their definition of Christianity. And so that's why it's important that we come together and work together in coalition, because Christian nationalism is a danger to all of us who are not in this narrow slice that wants to have power and privilege just for themselves.
You mentioned you spend a lot of time giving testimony in person at the Missouri State House and at the Capitol. What has been your experience as a citizen lobbyist in connecting with lawmakers, especially in this political climate where it can seem harder than ever to break through? Can you talk about maybe in your earlier times when you were just starting out with trying to connect with lawmakers, what seemed to work well? Emails, phone calls, in-person testimony? What's your experience been like?
Yeah, the in-person testimony is an important aspect, and I'll come to the other side in a moment. Particularly what I have found that if no one shows up on one side of a bill, the legislation can start to move a lot faster, right? Like, well, if no one's upset, then what's the harm of passing this legislation? And so I see my job as showing up just to try to pump the brakes a little bit. Because I know that in a red state like Missouri, a lot of the Christian nationalism that I'm testifying against probably has the votes. And so it's all about how can we slow the process down? How we can get some of the lawmakers to think, wait a minute, maybe there's some opposition to this. And we've seen time after time that these bills have failed, and they keep bringing them back up every year. I also found early on the importance of having a diversity of voices show up. This was a little bit of a light bulb moment. The first time I went and testified in a committee hearing was when I did that moment where I identified myself as a Baptist minister and I was speaking out against a Christian nationalist effort. And in that particular legislation, it was legislation that was targeting the LGBTQ community. And so primarily before I got up there to testify, it had been a couple of hours of testimony. It was a packed hearing. And it was a bunch of conservative Christians kept testifying for it. And then we'd go to the opposite side, and it was either LGBTQ individuals and activists or some members of the business community that were testifying against the legislation. And so when I stepped up as a minister that was on the opposition instead of on the front side, I saw the lawmakers' reactions because it changed the narrative of what they thought the bill was like. And I think that that's really important for us to have these diversity of perspectives. I've joked sometimes. There was one committee that I got done testifying in, and I sent a text message to a friend and said, I know it sounds like the beginning of a joke, but after a bunch of conservative Christians had testified for a bill, those in opposition were 2 atheists, 3 Jews, 4 Satanists, and a Baptist minister. I mean, imagine that group walks into a bar or walks into a committee hearing, and that's what we need. We have to come together. We have to show up.
Yeah, I agree. So what would you say to people who don't have the availability to go testify in person? What would be the next step and is the best way to break through to their elected officials?
Yeah, that's a good question because, one of the things I have learned, of course, is they don't really want to often hear from us. I mean, some lawmakers really are interested, but the hearings are not always run and organized at such a time when the average citizen can show up. So I recognize that because I live in the state capitol, that I have maybe an extra responsibility to show up because others that live hours away can't always show up for an 8 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the morning hearing. The education committee always meets like during the school day. Right. So it's like they don't even want to hear from educators. during, in these hearings. And so it is important to contact your own state representative and your own state senator, particularly when a bill is after it has passed a committee and it's going to go up to the floor, to start reaching out to them. But also you can contact every member of a committee ahead of a hearing. And this is going to vary a lot from state to state and even chamber to chamber. So in Missouri, on the House side, anybody in the state can fill out a testimony online. And so you get recorded as having testified even if you don't show up. That was a COVID rule that they've kept. The Senate side, they did that during COVID, and now you have to show up in person. But you can still email, every member of the committee with your concerns, what you would say. And that does mean something to them. If they hear from a lot of people on a bill, even if it doesn't change their vote, it might help put the brakes on the legislation to slow it down. And on these sessions where they have a timeline, and if they don't get done by the middle of May in Missouri, the bill dies, right? And so we don't have to get the votes to kill a bill. We just have to slow it down enough. And so it really can make a difference to reach out to them. When you go to your state capitol, if you have a chance, you can go by and visit your state lawmakers. But yeah, writing them a note, sending an email, sending a phone call, and putting it in your own words, right? Maybe, get some talking points from an organization, but don't just copy and paste, because if they get the same copy and paste message from everyone, they do tend to, I hear them, I heard them say they discount it, like, oh, it's just spam, right? Even though these are still individuals that are tied to an organization. So taking the key point and putting it in your own words and being respectful, being nice, even if they're going to vote against it, to be nice, to try to help get them to pause and think, is this something I actually want to continue to push?
That's great advice for people, especially in Missouri, because next week there's going to be a committee hearing in the same committee on Senate Bill 594, which would mandate the 10 Commandments posters be displayed in public school classrooms. Can you give us some information about that? And do you think it's going to move through like the school chaplain bill?
Yeah, I do unfortunately think that there's probably a good chance the bill will move, and I'll be there to testify against it. And this time I've also got some other ministers that are going to be showing up as well to try to speak out against it. And I know some other coalition groups are getting advocates there as well. And so it'll be really important. But then we're also working to get people like, hey, if you're not in mid-Missouri and you don't have a chance to show up, here's the committee members. You can send them a note. You can let them know why you're concerned about this legislation, which is, again, one of these hot topics. Louisiana passed it last year. Texas Senate just passed it, I guess yesterday. And so we're seeing this legislation also around the state to try to put, it's not even the 10 Commandments. It's an edited version of mostly Protestant ordering of the 10 Commandments, right? And so again, this is saying, this is the state picking winners and losers in religion. It's not just telling people who aren't Christian that you're a second-class citizen because this isn't part of your faith tradition. It's even telling Catholics and Lutherans that your church numbers the 10 Commandments incorrectly because this is the 10 Commandments. There are profound theological reasons why churches have different ways of interpreting the text here. And I use this language, state picking winners and losers. I think if you're in a red state like Missouri, that's particularly important to try to think about the lawmakers that you're writing to. How can we help them embrace this with their own ideology? Because I actually think a lot of conservatives would say they don't think the state should be picking winners and losers. They say that about business. They say that about a religion, right? So let's remind them that's what Christian nationalism does. It's not a conservative ideology in any traditional sense. So framing our arguments in a way to help reach the lawmakers where they are. I think that's also something to always keep in mind is our audience. And so, yeah, there's things I would like to say, and I don't say it because it's not helpful. And so it's how can I convince them to vote? And I might say something to you that's more provocative that I'm not going to say to a lawmaker because I'm trying to convince them.
Why do you think we're seeing such a push of Christian nationalist bills into public school classrooms, especially amongst the younger children in elementary school?
Yeah, it is the key area. I mean, I testify a half dozen or more times every legislative session, and 2/3, 3/4 of those times I'm in an education committee in either the House or the Senate. That is the key target of Christian nationalism. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. I think that those that are pushing this bill, they know that that's huge. If they can win the next generation, maybe they can change the demographic slide that they're losing. They can see the numbers. They can see that their ideology is aging out of the population. And so they're trying to change the next generation. Children are susceptible, right? So they think they can try some indoctrination. I think that's why we're seeing such a focus on education, not just on Christian, not just on like the Ten Commandments or chaplains, but even things like what can be taught, what subject matters, what books are we going to try to ban? All of this attention and energy is about trying to save the nation that they see themselves losing through demographics.
As you really pointed out, I just want to highlight a couple things that I like that you said. Pointing out that we need to delay these things because we know that this Christian national legislation is intentionally proposed in such a way that, in these states where there's a lot of conservative lawmakers, they feel like they can't take a stand against it. Now, they might be willing to let the bill die, but they're not going to be able to vote no. I mean, that's intentional. That's the purpose of why these things are being proposed, because it's very unpopular if they don't support some of these Christian nationalist things. So whatever we can do to help them, as you noted, to do the right thing. And oftentimes, the thing that they want to do. I think a lot of lawmakers know that these things are bad, even if they're Christian or whatever their beliefs are, but they feel pressured, and that's the whole point of Christian nationalism, is to pressure them into going with this and to make them, like that, lawmaker questioning you, like, wait, don't you understand? We're trying to put Christianity in the school. Like, I don't understand why you're not on board with us. Like, I thought we were on the same page here. Like, and that's obviously very intentional that they're doing that.
Yeah, very much. I think that's a great point.
Brian, what is your message to other faith leaders who are kind of on the sidelines, that are not comfortable with this Christian nationalist ideology that's hijacking their religious beliefs? What advice would you have to them?
Yeah, I think we have to speak up. So for Christian ministers, I tell them, if we don't speak up, then the version of Christianity that's in the public are going to be the loud voices of Christian nationalism. It's one of the reasons why I'm, clear to speak out as a Baptist minister, because, as the reactions show, people are like, wait, I thought Baptist would just be for this, right? And so I like to show that there's a different type of Baptist. That there are some of us, I've often called myself a Jimmy Carter type of Baptist, right? So my church is part of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship that Carter was part of for the last 35 years of his life. And so, there are different visions here. And that's the same in every Christian denomination. We have to stand up to, one, provide a better witness to our faith. But I also think we have a responsibility to show up because this is a democracy. This is a pluralistic society. And we need to be speaking out for the rights of everyone. And whoever is being targeted, whoever is being attacked, we have a responsibility. I think we have the responsibility as citizens. I think we also have a responsibility for those of us who are Christians in our faith teachings to actually speak out for and join alongside everyone. And I think that's just so critical and important. And I think a lot of clergy are nervous about getting too partisan. And so I always tell them, like, hey, this isn't, I'm not telling you to go tell people who to vote for. We're talking about legislation. It's political, but it's not partisan. As I noted with our bills, sometimes it's a bipartisan problem. And so that's different. We can focus on the issues without being partisan. And I think we have a responsibility to get engaged in the process, regardless who you are. But that's my call to ministers. And it can be scary to go testify for the first time. I usually try to walk people through it before they go. And there's a lot of great resources to help people think about, to learn the process in their own state. But honestly, after you've done it, you're like, well, okay, that wasn't so bad after all, right? I mean, it's just a couple of minutes. Share your opinion. Tell people why you don't like legislation, and most of the time they'll get off pretty easy. So
I think it's a good place for us to round up our conversation. Let's go ahead and bring in the audience and see what kind of questions we have. How do Christian nationalists react to arguments about other religions who might seek to impose their beliefs in schools?
So, this is, I think the only part we've really seen this is with the Satanic Temple, which is whereas more of a kind of a satirical effort of trying to push church-state separation. We have seen this debate on the chaplain legislation in Florida, and also it was in Missouri. In fact, right after I testified, a couple of individuals came up and said, "Hey, we think this legislation is bad, but if you all pass it, we're going to volunteer to be school chaplains," right? So, and the lawmakers, I mean, they just have a tizzy fit about this. They find they're completely offended, and they make it very clear that they don't think this is for everyone. They want the chaplains to be theirs. And anytime we see efforts to, like, the teaching the Bible in public schools bills, and there's amendments, and it's been in Missouri and Texas, multiple other states, of, well, why not have a more comparative religion? Let's put in the Quran. Let's put in the Book of Mormon, which, if you're talking about history, is actually really important in Missouri. And those amendments always get voted down because it's not about history. It's about codifying one religious tradition.
Yeah, kind of along those same lines. Bob asks, do you think it's possible to make Christians understand how offensive this is to followers of other beliefs? Now, I'll just say, we get in a lot of these situations, we do have people like the Satanic Temple coming out and arguing, and that sort of gets into that idea of like, oh, we'll show you how we feel when you're doing this. The way you feel about, Satanists being chaplains in schools, that's how we feel about you coming to the schools, things like that. But it seems like, at least in my experience, that doesn't always work. They just go, well, that's different. That's Satanism. That's different. It doesn't always get the message. I don't know if you, as a Christian, have an idea of how we might better get through to Christians, about how that makes people feel and get them to, sort of come over to the way you see things.
Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes it's hard when you're part of the majority culture to, put yourself in that minority perspective. And I do think, we were talking earlier about why a lot of Baptists gave up the idea of church-state separation. We moved from being a persecuted minority to being the largest Protestant group in the United States, right? And I think that power has corrupted. I have heard, for instance, of Christians who moved to, say, Utah, and then when they realize that the religion that's being pushed in public schools is that of the Church of Latter-day Saints, that they have some significant theological disagreements with, that it suddenly clicks of like, oh, whoa, like, I don't want that taught to my children because we have these different religious beliefs over here. And I think that trying to help people imagine what would it be like to be in a place where it's another religious tradition that's telling your children what to believe and, maybe even how to pray. I mean, we're seeing those types of bills come back. And so that's a difficult thought experiment, but it's really important.
It's a really great comment, because we often hear that religious beliefs or historical documents are taught in schools before the historical reasons. And if you look at a state like Utah and the influence of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, it is part of their history as a state. And so they could be fully justified using that same argument to push that curricula within their schools. As someone who has a doctorate in political communications, also a Baptist minister, what are some other tips you have for reframing conversations to help break through to our Republican colleagues and friends who can't quite connect the dots?
Yeah, and I think we have to talk about history, right? I mean, history can be adjusted, it can be manipulated, and the historical founding era is so much more complex than we give it credit. I mean, we had this debate in the founding era. There were founding fathers who wanted us to be a Christian nation. John Adams advocated that position early on. Patrick Henry wanted us to be a Christian nation. In fact, Patrick Henry is who James Madison and Thomas Jefferson are actually working against when they disestablish the Anglican Church from the Virginia colony. And so what we see is a lot of cherry picking of history. And so I think sometimes it's helpful to go and give that fuller history of the radical experiment of church-state separation that the United States went with. But I also think it's important just to help people think not just about the historical, but to realize that I find it offensive a lot of times, the rhetoric that has made that this is just a historical document. The Bible is historical importance. The Ten Commandments are historical, as if we're going to strip away the sacredness of the text, right? I mean, I don't read the Bible because it's a history book. I don't read the Bible because of its historical influence. I read it for profound, sincere religious reasons. And so helping people realize that this history argument is itself just an attempt to sneak in religion through the back door is important to push back on.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that in terms of the, your views on the Bible, because I know when I was growing up, see, this never, now, we do a lot of work in the schools about separation of church and state, and it never occurred to me that this could even be a problem because of what you're talking about. That, like, my art teacher, I remember growing up, would read us Greek stories, about the Greek gods, like every day. And they did this, she did this for years. And so I learned all about the Greek mythology and all of that. And, the reason why that I now obviously view that as okay is that nobody in that classroom, the teacher himself, was not like thinking, oh, these are my real beliefs, that not holding it sacred, and so I take your point that obviously could be a threat to your religion if the Bible, they wanted to do that in the same way, to be like, well, we'll just tell these as stories, and then and then obviously that also causes problems for teachers who have to answer questions from people who say, oh, did that really happen? Oh, and then it just creates a whole issue. So another good question here that I think is good, summing up the purposes of the show. How can secular and religious advocates begin to work together to better fight state and church separation? Obviously, we've got this here, FFRF. We've worked with the Baptist Joint Committee, Amanda Tyler, many times. We work with Americans United, which comprises a lot of the sort of religious people fighting for separation of church and state. And obviously, we've got you on here and working with groups like that. But do you have any other thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, first of all, I'll just say, I really appreciate the invite as a way of modeling this idea of we need to be talking to each other and working together. And you also mentioned a couple other great examples. I think, for instance, FFRF and BJC had the joint report together on Christian nationalism in the January 6th insurrection, which is something I've quoted and cited, from a lot. And I will note that, just for full disclosure, I am on the board nationally of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And, that is all about trying to bring people together, regardless of religious traditions, religious beliefs or none. And so that is just so critical, just these spaces where we get to know each other, that we talk with each other. And sometimes it's just as simple as, we show up in the same hearing room and then it's like, okay, you and I both testified on the same side here. Let's go grab a cup of coffee and figure out what other commonality we might have. That's honestly, it's how I've met some of the Missouri, people, is I didn't know them before, but we connect, afterwards because of the hearing. But ways that we can work together, get to know each other, so that way we don't view each other with suspicion. It's just it's that same kind of basic idea. We just have to get to know each other, and that can't happen without conversation.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I'll say I also was one of the type of people who was skeptical of just like, well, how can a Christian really advocate for state-church separation? When they've got these strong beliefs about the world and about religion and spreading the gospel, things like that. Like, how can they do it? But then, in reflecting, I'm like, okay, well, actually, I feel the same way. I'm a very strong atheist. I don't believe in God, but I also would not want a teacher in a school telling children that God's not real, so I can even see from that perspective. It's like, oh yeah, I don't want that interference. This is not a place for a school teacher or school administrations to be having these discussions, So that then helps me realize oh, okay, yeah. So definitely people like yourself are out there on the other side that are like, hey, these are my beliefs, but nobody else has to hold them, and the government should not be imposing them, and I think that just makes sense. I think a lot of people, when they, really think about it, realize that, oh yeah, that just makes everything better. If going through our government, going through our lives, we have a secular society where we all hold our own beliefs and we don't have to worry about people, trying to convert us in every situation. We can just, kind of work better together.
Yeah, and I think, Jefferson and Madison is such an interesting historical combo in thinking about this. I mean, Jefferson's cutting out, miracles of Jesus and the resurrection from the New Testament. I mean, Jefferson, by any church today, would be pretty much considered a heretic, right? We can probably understand, why Jefferson really wants church-state separation, because he's going to be, early on the list of people persecuted. Madison, on the other hand, is a member of the Anglican Church, and by all accounts, quite devout. So he's a member of the privileged state church that was actually, the state church was persecuting some of my ancestors spiritually, as well as actually genetic Baptists in Virginia who fled the colony. And so, but then he takes the side of church-state separation and actually joins with Jefferson to disestablish his own church. I mean, that's a fascinating partnership right there.
Yeah, and we actually recently had an episode of Free Thought Matters that talked a lot about Jefferson and Madison that people can check out on our YouTube page. Let's do another question here. So has your work inspired other religious advocates to join you, or are you still largely an anomaly as a minister fighting against student proselytization? Like, have you, in your experience of doing this, has anyone ever come out and told you, like, hey, I just started doing, you know, I heard you speak and now I also want to join you in this fight, or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing some people grow. And I would say most times I still am the only one or one of only a couple that can show up, just because the hearing schedules and travel and so forth in the Missouri Capitol. But we have a number of ministers who are now writing to their lawmakers. Like I said, we have a few that are going to show up with me next week on the Ten Commandments bill. And I'm also connecting with people in other states and thinking about how can we, get involved in testifying better. I'll actually be leading a workshop for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship nationally this summer with this whole goal of teaching clergy. How can we testify? How can we get involved? Because people are seeing that this is something that we need to be doing more of.
Awesome. We can go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you so much for coming on our show this week, Brian.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, can you tell our viewers where they can follow your work in defending church-state separation?
Yeah, I'll just give maybe a couple of plugs here. So I write regularly about religion and politics at publicwitness.wordandway.org. So you can kind of follow our work there. Also co-authored a book that just came out last year, Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism. And this is a little bit different take. There are probably like 100 books that came out on Christian nationalism the last couple of years, and 99 of them are about the role that conservative evangelicals and Pentecostals had in shaping Christian nationalism today. This is about mainline Protestants. And so there's a lot of history in there, in how In God We Trust became the national model, Under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, and the dangers that this Christian nationalism has. So those are a couple different ways people can connect.
Awesome. All right, well, that wraps up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. A new episode of our broadcast TV show, Free Thought Matters, airs this weekend. FFRF co-presidents Annie-Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker will speak with journalist and author Catherine Stewart about her new book, Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy.
Conservatism doesn't really describe the anti-democratic movement. This is a movement that wants to destroy the existing order and replace it with something entirely new, which really isn't a conservative move remotely. True conservatives would want to preserve institutions of value that have served us over time. They would want to conserve and sustain and even bolster alliances that have led to a certain measure of post-war stability. But the intellectuals of the new right provide a lot of the ideology in support of this radical move. It's their voices that make this into a genuinely anti-democratic movement. And they have formed an important alliance with Christian nationalist leaders.
You'll be able to watch that episode on TV stations around the country this weekend and soon on the FFRF YouTube channel.
And don't miss our weekly radio show, Free Thought Radio. This week, Dan and Annie-Laurie will speak with former minister Rob Haskell. You can find Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio or wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to check out the latest episode of We Dissent, the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers discussing state church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get your podcasts, or check us out online at we-dissent.org.
Finally, if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us. And we will see you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.